Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. We go to the phones. Joining us on this great Monday, great friend of the program, editor of QuorumReport.com. It's Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
Doing well, Chad. I missed y'all last week, and of course I missed the big announcement. I could give you grief and say, "What? You're not too famous to call me now?" Is that right? Aren't you the most famous man in West Texas?
I think that's something. Yeah, I think that's true.
Don't forget about us little people. No, just in all seriousness, I did want to say congratulations. It's big responsibility, but they could not pick anybody better to fill the role.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that, Scott. It's the session is underway. What's currently going on down in Austin?
Interesting. They now have the redistricting process underway. It's as was described by Senator Kel Seliger this morning from West Texas. He said it's, other than the budget, the most important thing that they do because, in his words, it affects every single Texan. And it's all about allocation of power, right? The redistricting process can be something that will make people's eyes glaze over because the actual way that they do it, Chad, can be very boring. Hours and hours and hours of testimony. In fact, the special Senate redistricting committee has a hearing every day this week. They started this morning at 9, and they're going through Friday and taking a look at each region of the state, starting with West Texas, and that's why Senator Seliger is present in the room today, even though he's not actually on the redistricting committee. Same thing for Senator Cesar Blanco, who's from El Paso. He's interested in the West Texas part of this, but he's not on the committee. As you know, from Lubbock, Charles Perry is on the redistricting committee, and he talked about it being, his second redistricting process and just how important it all is. And look, Chad, we have had, just to back up and give the the broader picture here, the way it works, is they do the census, and that's the counting of everybody in the state and the country to figure out where people live and how many people are in each community. And then after that, the state legislatures draw the political maps, for the state House, the state Senate, and the congressional districts. We're expected to pick up as many as 3 congressional districts in Texas, and that will mean that we'll have more representation. In Washington, the whole idea is to honor the principle of one person, one vote, and that each person gets equal representation. We have seen just exponential, explosive growth in Texas over the last decade between this census that was done last year and the one that was done 10 years ago. Stop me if you've heard this before. COVID kind of messed up the census. It messed up everything, right? And so it has delayed the census. So usually they'd be starting this process now, and they would go ahead and do the redistricting process during the regular session. But as was pointed out during the hearing this morning, the data may not come from the federal government in time for the legislature to really do this during the legislative session. So we may see a special session of the legislature before the year is out. But where has that growth been, Chad? It's been, not in West Texas for sure, not in East Texas, but in sort of the triangle, of the major population areas. The triangle that's, on the top of it is Dallas-Fort Worth on down to Austin and San Antonio on one side, and then heading over to Houston on the other. And in a state of 30 million people, you had 1,000 people moving to Texas every day. That's kind of the norm for us, but also 1,000 people moving here a day when the shutdowns were going on last year, Chad. So we've not seen any slowdown in our growth, and that means that certain places are going to lose out on representation. And, if you're somebody from West Texas, you're especially interested in this because
yes.
While they're going to get more representation in places like Houston and Dallas, it's going to be lessened in places like Lubbock and Tyler, et cetera.
Yeah, and so how important is it? You mentioned State Senator Charles Perry. How important is his role in defending, the West Texas area?
He's got to look out for it, and, the whole idea is to be equitable and fair, and, of course, these things always end up in court, but it's usually about partisanship, usually about accusations of racial discrimination, diluting minority voting strength. When it comes down to the mechanics of doing this, basically he and others who are from those rural areas will try to hold the line as much as they can on how much representation they get in Austin, in Washington as well. But it's going to be difficult because, every time this conversation comes up in Austin right now, the first thing that folks will say, longtime observers will say is, well, if you look out at East Texas, they're going to have districts that will be consolidated. You might have a place where there's 2 state representatives, and suddenly now they have 1. And the same thing could be true there in Lubbock as well, while they continue to grow in places like Houston. I would think that in those urban and suburban areas, that Republicans, as they try to shore up their Republican majorities in both the Texas House and Senate, as well as try to preserve the Republican majority in the delegation to Washington, what they'll do is try to move some of those districts in the urban areas, stretch them out a little bit further into the suburban areas and the rural areas. This is kind of a joke way to think about it, but it's not completely out of the question. That you might have, for example, somebody like Fort Price, who represents Amarillo in the Texas House, and the joke way to think about it would be, well, he might have a district that suddenly goes all the way from Amarillo to about 5 hours away down in suburban Fort Worth.
Yeah.
That sounds a little crazy, but right now I'm sitting in a congressional district represented by Michael McCall, who's from Austin, and this congressional district does go from here in Austin all the way to Houston, about 2.5 hours away.
Yeah, I mean, you do have districts that are, they may not be 5 hours, but they may be 4.5 right now. So the 5 hour drive is it's you can't take that off the table, because it could absolutely happen.
Right, and someone like Kel Seliger, who represents the Panhandle and other parts of West Texas, down into Amarillo, his district is geographically larger than the state of Indiana, and as you know, he gets around the district, by flying in a small plane, maybe the only way you can do it in some of these big areas.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's see, what about budget? The budget processes, the Senate and the House have released at least their initial budgets.
Yeah, and they're strikingly similar, Chad, and trying to figure this out. There's a couple of questions about this. One, why is the House budget and the Senate budget so similar? Usually in the past, that's not the norm. Usually in the past, the Senate will put out a budget that lists the priorities of the senators, and they put it in they're going a certain direction with it, while the House will go in a different direction. And this is just the natural tension of a budget writing process in Austin for the state of Texas over a 2-year budget cycle. It's a huge effort. We should underscore the fact that the budget, we were just talking about redistricting, which to the lawmakers themselves, there's 2 kinds of bills that they read every word of, Chad, and those are redistricting bills and ethics bills, because those are the bills that have to do with their jobs. The budget would be second to that, but as far as what they constitutionally have to do, the budget is number one. It's the only thing that they're constitutionally mandated to do during the regular session, and it's a quarter. Think about how big our state is. It's a $250 billion spending plan that is written over a 24-month horizon. I don't know if you or I could, figure out our exact budgets for the next 2 years, but that's the way the state budget process works. And so it may be that during COVID, and because we're having this sort of pared-down legislative session where there is less interaction, at least, person-to-person interaction between the lawmakers, they want to also cut down on how much time they'll spend negotiating this budget. They were both at about $7 billion more than what the comptroller laid out in his estimate. As you know, at the very beginning of the legislative session, the thing that the legislature gets first is the estimate of how much money's in the bank, and the comptroller, Glenn Hager, is the one who does that. Both of these budgets are about $7 billion more than what he said was in the bank. So they start with a level about $119 billion, almost $120 billion to be spent, and that would mean not much in the way of cuts in this state budget. But again, that's over and beyond what he had said was there, which was about just a little more than $112 billion or so, something like that. And so the thought is that, one, you do have some of that federal CARES Act, the COVID relief funding, a little more than $2 billion left over from the first CARES Act funding from Washington. That was extended. Remember, when they first passed that, and Senator Cornyn had pointed this out, when they first passed that, it was supposed to be spent for sure before the end of the year, but that was extended into this year. And we do expect probably another $4 billion or so in the next tranche of money from Washington. So that gets you to roughly the amount of difference between what Hager laid out and what these budgets look like. So it may be that, while we go right back to the good old days, Chad, of bad-mouthing Washington, with Democrats in the White House and already the Attorney General suing, over immigration, and groups like the Texas Public Policy Foundation saying they're going to sue Joe Biden, even though they don't know what for yet. But they're ready to do it. Whatever, they're they're on guard. They're spring-loaded to do that. But at the same time, it may be this federal funding that's bailing us out on our budget, and we may be right back to close to where we were when they laid out the budget in 2019.
Interesting. Let's talk about some other things that may come up during the session, and that is the governor, I think last week at a roundtable discussion, he had mentioned a statewide ban on, I guess basically public or urban camping, which is, targeted at Austin and the homeless situation there in Austin. And then I think it also talked about withholding tax money to some of these cities like Austin. It seems like he has a problem with the city of Austin.
And he does live here too.
Yeah. And other cities that would defund their police departments. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the governor does live here. It's kind of like if the guy who writes angry letters to the editor about what City Hall is doing, if that guy was the governor of Texas. What are they doing down there? There are so many issues where Austin, as you point out, has become the face of whatever that issue is. And in this city, we do have, I think it's fair to say, just objectively, I live here too, it's a crisis with what's gone on with our homelessness situation and the challenges. And as you know, the city council made it legal for folks to basically camp almost anywhere they want in a public space, along the roadways, in parks and trails. And I have to say it this way, Chad, there's a lot of people who will say that it's sort of heartless to say that you would have to kick those people out of those places. But I don't think that that the homeless folks who are living in those situations, that they're well taken care of at all. Their health and safety is in question. In the middle of the wintertime, they're living in tents where it's cold and miserable. They don't have the access to services that you and I have, electricity and water and all of that, being able to take a shower and things like that. Cleanliness, health and safety, very important. And think about what that would be like in the middle of the Texas summer, when it's not uncommon for it to be over 100 degrees and just miserable in the city of Austin. The governor doesn't want the city to continue to do that. We just put up at quorumreport.com, you might want to check it out, longtime veteran of the Texas Capitol, Steve Bresnan, who also lives here, another area man, if you will. He has laid out a specific plan for these homelessness challenges in Austin, which includes, giving these folks immediate shelter. He's identified one shelter. It's actually an old Home Depot location that is owned by the city, where they would have access to services, where they can move a lot of these folks there quickly. And the governor, as you point out, has said he's going to have the state legislature do something about this if the city doesn't do something quickly. And that, of course, would threaten the autonomy of the city. And there's all this tension between the cities, the counties, and the state. It continues to hold over from the last couple of sessions. As you know, the House leadership was caught on tape talking about how they hate cities and counties and want to rein in their ability to do stuff. And I think a lot of the other leaders of cities and counties around the state, to people who are elected to positions not in Austin, but the county judges in different places and mayors, they probably lament the fact that often the city of Austin is the one that is the face of all these different issues, because they just can't get out of their own way a lot of times, Chad, with the way they're handling things when it comes to the police, when it comes to homelessness, et cetera. I think you will see some movement on this in the Texas Legislature. But I do think Mr. Bresnan makes a good case for the city of Austin doing something immediately so that they don't lose out on their own ability to chart their own course on this.
This idea of, if you defund the police, then, you could have, some tax money withheld from your city. Has there been a definition or a line that says, this is how much you can cut, if you need to, like, let's say you needed to buy 20 new police cruisers this year, and next year you don't need to, so you don't need to budget that money in. That's not a defunding of the police department. That is maybe just tidying things up. Is there a definition yet floating around of what a defund may look like at all?
It's an excellent question, and I've heard a lot of conservatives ask this. Any cut at all to a government program would be seen as, quote, defunding the police. The governor has not answered those questions in any news conference that I've seen and not laid out any specifics about that. When he was asked about it, he simply said that that's what the legislative process is for, Chad, to come up with the answers to those questions and to fill in the blanks on this sort of a policy. But, yeah, immediately when the governor said that any sort of defunding police would result in the defunding of a city, there's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in on that. And so far we don't know the answer. And that's why I'm not sure that whatever they pass is going to be as punitive as some folks think it might be. But there is energy for this. I mean, the Republican candidates around the state, spurred on by the governor, those who ran for the Texas House in particular and the Texas Senate as well, they won their races largely on opposition to, quote, defunding police. So I would expect them to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Scott, tell folks what they can find over at quorumreport.com this week.
We're tracking this redistricting hearing process, which is just fascinating. One thing I didn't really mention about it is that it's the first hearing process in which testimony is being done virtually. How's that working? We'll get into it. And also we have the legislature back in town for their second week as we get going here. They have stretched things out. They took a week off, so it'll actually be their second week here in Austin starting tomorrow through Wednesday. We've got it all for you at quorumreport.com. Click on subscriptions. We'll get you signed up.
All right, very good. Scott, as always, appreciate your time, and we'll visit again with you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Have fun with your hours and hours and hours of radio.
Yes, that is the plan. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Talk soon.
That's Scott Braddock, editor of quorumreport.com.